the Classic is obviously the centerpiece, although it's in the middle of the card now on Saturday, which is like that's going to be a little bit weird. It's like having Act 5 in the middle of a play. But it's an interesting field in that, you know, we were talking about this a little bit off air. There are some foreign influences that are going to be major players in this classic. You don't see that with a dirt classic all that often. City of Troy, Forever Young. We also have the 3-year-olds. It's been a pretty strong 3-year-old crop in Fierceness and Sierra Leone. Tink, you know, you have a lot of thoughts about this. I want to ask you about City of Troy in particular, but just tell us a little bit about how, you know, take an overview of the classic and the way you think it's shaping up.
Well, you know, on the one hand, one qualification, you know, we're all at a little bit of a disadvantage because it's just an irony of timing. The PPs that the Racing Form produces for the pre-entries come out, I believe, tomorrow. So we don't really have that full set of PPs right in front of us. But I thought that I would like to focus on what I consider to be the 3 most interesting horses in the race. Perhaps they'll be the 3 favorites. We don't know about scratches and so on, but City of Troy, of course, is one of them. Fierceness would be the American trained horse of greatest interest, and then we have the Japanese horse Forever Young. I think that it's particularly interesting classic because, you know, how often do you find not 1 but 2 foreign trained horses that are going to be taken very seriously by the bettors, and that, you know, no one would be really surprised to see win. That's a very uncommon situation. We're much more used to big surprises like our Kang or Saki running Tisnow to a neck. And well, Arazi wasn't a surprise, but that was 1 horse and it was a 2-year-old. But yeah, I think this is a very interesting race because of the international. And there are going to be other Japanese runners that I'm not going to touch on today, but I'd like to focus on these 3. And that's part of the reason. The other reason is that I think all 3 of them have qualities or aspects to their form that are not so obvious to a lot of people. And I'm sure that there are a lot of sophisticated people who may disagree with some of my takes, but I think that they're worth airing, and I'd like to hear what the 2 of you have to say about them. So if you want, we can start with City of Troy. You want to start with City of Troy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
The first thing I want to say about City of Troy is that, as the regular readers of my Twitter feed, X feed, know, I have been very critical through the use of satire mainly of Aidan O'Brien relating to his, what I consider to be well over the top hyperbole relating to this horse. Now, in no way am I suggesting that the horse is not an outstanding horse. He's been beaten once in his career. He was a 2-year-old champion. He won the English Derby. I mean, obviously he's an outstanding horse. I'm not trying to make any argument to the contrary. But when you listen consistently to what O'Brien has been saying, you know, he's been saying for a long time now that it's the best horse that they've ever had at Ballydoyle, the best horse he's ever trained. And just to put that into some perspective, numerical perspective, but I think useful perspective. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. I provided a graphic that's a tweet that the viewers might be seeing, which was an example of the kind of satire. I mean, I was being over the top myself. That was in response to an interview of O'Brien after a workout not long ago, which was his primary workout for the upcoming Breeders' Cup.
This is one where he said that it was the first horse he's ever had work well at Southwell.
Well, no, that was he may have said that. I made fun of him prior to the work when he said no horse has ever worked well for us at Southwell, you know, leading up to the Breeders' Cup. And I did some quick research and found that was absolutely false, that Galileo and others had worked well on it. So setting aside that he wasn't even honest in the lead up to it, you know, he was still talking about best horse he's ever trained. And so I made fun of it with what you can see. on the graphic of my tweet. But I wanted to go on to say that after his most recent win, O'Brien was interviewed on one of the British broadcasting channels that was carrying the race, and about as much as these kind of journalists are inclined to do to an important figure like that, he was pushed a little bit about his claim that this is the best horse he ever trained, and he said, he made a couple of further embellishments, and then the presenter or the journalist said, there are 19 horses that you have trained that time form rates more highly than City of Troy. Now, come on. I'm not going to bother parsing it out. I'm not going to claim that they're all better than him. But if there are 19 horses that were more highly rated than this horse, how do you, without hesitation, claim that this is clearly the best horse you've ever trained? It's hyperbole. The reason that I've reacted as strongly as I have is because we're talking about a trainer who is, of course, widely considered to be one of the greatest ever, and has had a tremendous career already. If he retired tomorrow, one of the great careers ever, and has made a huge amount of money and trains for people who are immensely wealthy. Why is there such a need for this kind of hyperbole? We know it's related to his impending stud duties. Why do they need to do this? Why can't they just let his merits do the talking, his performances do the talking? It seems, frankly, a bit unseemly to me. How do you guys feel about that, by the way?
Well, yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. Sorry, John. That's the one thing I wanted to follow up on is, they've had tons of great horses who are going to become stallions over the years. I wanted to know, like, what you were implying. Like, it seems like I don't know. I don't know why the hype train is so heavy for this horse, but like they've had to stand horses, after their racing career for decades now. What is it about this horse that you think they need to make such a PR push for?
Well, if I can jump in there,
yeah, go ahead.
For a second. I think it's twofold. Again, not trying to get into their heads, because it's always a difficult navigation. But number one, I think they truly believe that City of Troy is a once in a generational talent. And that they want to push him because they've already announced that he's going to be standing at stud, in Ireland, and he'll probably be one of the top, most expensive horses there. But the other thing is that you have to remember they also own and manage Justify, City of Troy's sire. And Justify has been a very, very consistently top stallion here in the States. But you can make the argument that he hasn't had a son yet that has hit the ground running as far as stallion prospects. And I know he is still relatively young, and therefore he's not begetting a lot of sons that are retiring at stud. But if you look at the lineup of Justify's sons, I think it benefits them on two different planes, both in Europe, in Ireland, with City of Troy, going to be standing there, and also Justify here going to be standing, or continue to stand here. So they're looking at it, I think, from a two-prong attack, saying, hey, if this horse, City of Troy, if we hype him to the extent that we believe he's a very good horse, and he campaigns well and wins the Classic on the dirt in the States, then we benefit on two different levels, two very high levels. I mean, Justify is probably, the most expensive stallion here in the States, if not one of the top two or three stallions expense-wise. So they benefit, exponentially if this comes to fruition, that City of Troy ends up winning the Breeders' Cup Classic. And just to, Tony, before we spin it back to you, I want to make a counter argument that I feel like that this year's Breeders' Cup Classic is going to be one of the weakest groups that we've seen in a long time. You can certainly make a case, and I know you will, about Fierceness and his abilities. And he's certainly, when he's on, he's on, and when he's not, he's not. And there's questions as to why that is. Forever Young, who again internationally is one of the top horses in the world, especially compared, for the rating system. But we still don't know where Forever Young fits in the hierarchy of top horses. I don't think we're going to look back at this group that's entered in the race and look fondly about it like we do in 22 when Flightline and Olympiad and Taba ran, or in 2010 when Blame and Zenyatta, or APND and Pleasant. I don't think we're going to look back fondly and say, wow, what a group top to bottom that classic, the 24 classic was. For a lot of reasons, and I think, Tink, you're going to go into this later on in the show about durability issues, but there just aren't a lot of good top horses that are going to be represented in the classic this year.
Well, I agree, John. I was not, perhaps I wasn't clear. I was not suggesting that this is a particularly strong edition. I agree with you completely. I think it's a weak edition. I just think that it's interesting because of the international aspect of it, and because of some of the weaknesses that I'm going to touch on now in what I think are probably the three headline horses of the race. So we're in agreement
and I'm
about
glad
everything.
That we have some international horses coming in, because otherwise this would be a really weak group, so I'm agreeing with you. I think that City of Troy and Forever Young add some spice to this year's group, because otherwise it's a lackluster group. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No problem. Yeah, I agree. I mean, you look at some of the other horses that are potentially, going to be in the race, and they're, the odd low triple digit buyer figure. I mean, these are very ordinary horses, and even the three that we're talking about, there are questions relating to all of them. So let's get into it. City of Troy, for those U.S. viewers who haven't followed him closely this year, well, he was a champion 2-year-old last year. He made his return in the spring in the 2000 Guineas, a classic mile race at Newmarket in Britain, and ran a remarkably poor race. He finished down the field, I think it was 9th of 11 or something like that, beaten 17 lengths. And especially given all of the hype surrounding the horse, the Aiden went to great lengths to try to explain, why he thought things went wrong in that race. And without taking up too much time, I frankly thought that his excuse given for that performance was ridiculous. He talked about how, the horse's heart rate went up when he was unsettled in the stalls. He was the last horse loaded. I timed it. He was literally in the stall for 5 seconds. I'm not 5 seconds. Now, anyone who's been around the game has seen horses that have acted up for minutes before a race, and sometimes they win. That can't be, it's hard for me to imagine that was an excuse. So, okay, you draw a line through it. Clearly, that's the only time he's lost in his career. So something did go wrong. I'm not sure what it was, but something went wrong. In the Derby, which he won, the English Derby, excuse me, I think it was...
I'll come after you if you pronounce it wrong.
I think it was a pretty average field. The second place horse called Ambient Friendly, was not ridden very well. The rider was sitting as City of Troy burst clear and started to draw away. He waited too long to, I don't know why.
Was Luan Machado on that horse? I think was that.
I'll have to check that. But that horse that finished second, Ambient Friendly, has subsequently finished third as a 6-4 favorite in the Irish Derby. He finished 10th in the Juddmonte International and last of 5 in a Group 2 in France. So he's done nothing to frank the form, as they say. The third place finisher in the Derby, also trained by O'Brien, horse called Los Angeles, did come back to win the Irish Derby, but the form of that is not so strong. And he was fourth in the Irish Champion Stakes, not a particularly good effort. And he was third in the Arc, which was a nice effort, good for him. He's a nice horse, but this is not going to go down as a particularly strong Derby for the ages. So credit where it's due, he did win the race. But not a great field. He then came back in a Group 1 called the Coral Eclipse at Sandown. He was the 1-4 favorite, which gives you an idea of the quality of the field. And he only won in workmanlike style. He beat an older horse named Al Rifa by a length, and he was getting 10 pounds from that horse. Okay. So it really was not a very strong effort. And again, there were various excuses made, whatever. And then his most recent race was the Juddmonte International. And he was more impressive there for sure. But he ended up on the lead, which was surprising to everyone. And the reason he ended up on the lead is because it was a very moderate pace. No one else really wanted it. And Ryan Moore, who was one of the world's top jockeys, took advantage of the situation. And he, as he has done in all of his races, he never showed any real quick acceleration. He just ran on very well to hold a French trained horse named Colin Doggin, safe by a half length. And that horse came from well off the pace. So that the second place finisher who was beaten a half length was actually disadvantaged by the pace. And City of Troy held the advantage tactically. The third, fourth, and fifth place finishers in the race all raced close up, which underscores that the pace was not taxing. So what you have with City of Troy is an outstanding horse, but a horse that doesn't really have an explosive acceleration. He's more of a galloping type. And if anyone wants to argue with that, I'd like to provide a quote from Ryan Moore when he was finished with the race at York. And he was quoted as saying, once he gets into his rhythm, he can maintain his gallop. When he gets it right, he will keep going. It's like an elite athlete who can keep going at an 800-meter pace and keep timing it out. So this is a rider who everyone believes is one of the best riders in the world, and who is the first string rider for Aidan O'Brien and the Ballydoyle runners. And he's essentially saying that he's a galloper. This is a horse that now. Aidan has also suggested, he hasn't been quite as clear, but he suggested the same thing by talking about, we haven't seen them go fast enough for him yet. In other words, his stamina hasn't been tested yet. Right. And so there are all sorts of indications, not only that it's a weakness that this horse has, that if he were to face a horse with a real acceleration, he would probably be in trouble. And the second point is relating to the Breeders' Cup, that he's very likely to be ridden aggressively in that race. He's very likely because Moore and his connections are going to much prefer a test of stamina than a race where you've got a bunch of 6 horses at the quarter pole that are going to sprint to the wire after a slow pace. That would disadvantage him. So they're likely to ride him aggressively. As a final point, I don't have any opinion on his workout at Southwell because it was on Tapeta. And I don't think anyone has any way of knowing whether or not a horse that works well on Tapeta is necessarily going to run well on the Del Mar dirt surface. So they were happy with the work. It was, superficially impressive, but I don't think we're really going to know how well he's going to handle the dirt until he's on the track. So before I go on to the other two, why don't you two chime in on City of Troy and your impressions?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like what you say about him potentially just being a galloper. He doesn't have that flashy acceleration that a lot of the more turf horses have. Maybe that sets him up better for a dirt race. Because it really is more, the classic is more of a test of stamina, especially these days where most horses in America don't really want to go 1.25 miles. I can count on one hand the horses I would think of that are actually going to excel going a longer distance. One of them's probably not going to be in the classic and next. And I think that's an interesting case for him in the classic. And, it's just, I'm curious, like, why they're like, I'm going back to my original point, why they're pushing him so hard. I know John said he's a son of Justify, and that matters a lot, but he's going to be a super duper popular stallion, regardless of whether or not Aidan O'Brien talks him up in interviews or not. It does seem a little aberrant in terms of the way he's talking about him. But like we were talking about, it's going to add so much juice to the classic in a race that normally I'd sleep through, even though it's 3:00 in the afternoon. I'd find a way to sleep through it because I don't care about Arthur's Ride or First Mission or any of these bums that are going to be in the race. I think that this is at least it provides a lot of intrigue, and it takes guts, I gotta say. Like, I know they have a ton of nice horses and they can afford to take risks, but I do think it takes guts to send him over here to run him in the classic, to hype him up this much. Because if he lays an egg, like, it's gonna look like they screwed up and ran him in the wrong race, and that's gonna be the lasting impression for his stud career. But I think I always appreciate when trainers are willing to step outside the box and do something that their horses have never done before, and so I'm looking forward to it. John, go ahead.
Joe, I would disagree with one point on that, and that is, I think they're playing with house money. I think at this point, if they run him in the classic and he lays an egg and he doesn't run any good, they can always point to his past performances and say he was still the greatest horse in Europe. He was still one of the greatest turf horses, and yeah, we took a shot. We could have run him in the turf race, Breeders' Cup Turf, but we wanted to see just how good he is, and that's why we ran in the classic. So I think that it's kind of a lose situation at this point. If he had run in the turf and won, everyone would have been like, yeah, all right, that makes sense, and there wouldn't have been any additional juice for him as a stallion, nor for maybe a little bit more for Justify as a stallion. But if he wins the classic, if he comes here and wins the classic, I mean that still is, other than the Derby, that is still the most highly sought after crown that people shoot for. I would say to the audience, just on a different note, that if you ever have a chance to go on to racingpost.com, they do a great job of interviewing the jockeys, the trainers, and the owners post race, and they get and the Euros, to their credit, are pretty frank about
they're much more honest.
They're much more honest about, I mean, they'll even say, like, if a horse isn't running good, you get the jockey that comes off the mount, and he's not going to say, well, maybe this. They'll say the horse stunk. The horse definitely is not up to this level. I mean, they'll say it more eloquently because they use the King's English as opposed to the Queen's English, as opposed to the knucklehead.
You know why that is, John? Not to interrupt. You know why that is? Because I think in America, the jockeys and the trainers, when they give quotes, are talking to the owners.
Yeah.
Overseas, they're talking to the press.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I would agree. I would agree with that 100%. So it's worth going onto racingpost.com just to read some of these quotes. And they do it by date order. So you can read about a certain race that a horse ran in, and then see if he, and they say, we're going to try blinkers next time, or we're going to try this next time. And in the next race, they actually implement that strategy, or that new equipment, and then they'll comment about that. So it's interesting how the progression works. And you can see, what their true feelings are about horses. That to me is the most important thing. I'm going to project ahead for a second also, and I'm not talking about the classic, but Tony, with regard to like the races in Saudi Arabia and in Dubai, with those huge purses and everything like that, if this is an example of the worldwide talent pool for older horses in the Breeders' Cup Classic, how is that going to play out in those races for even more money?
Well, I've been a big critic of the what I consider to be spiraling out of control purses in those kind of races. I mean, obviously, each jurisdiction has its own incentives. Dubai, you can certainly understand why they began with the Dubai World Cup and made it a big day. And Sheikh Mohammed is the biggest consumer of racehorses in the history of the sport. And it's understandable why he would do that. Saudi, as you know, although I don't follow it closely, I'm not a golf fan and tennis fan, but Saudi has chosen in recent years to become players in the world sports stage. And how do they do that? By throwing ridiculous sums of money at the established, professional players, or in this case, his horses. And so, unfortunately, I say unfortunate. Of course, if you're an owner who has a horse in one of those races that has a big chance, then there's nothing unfortunate about it. But there's really, no close correlation between the quality of the fields and the size of the purses. And this is also actually, it's a segue. I don't want to get off on the tangent to any, long degree, but it's a segue to the problem of, it's always been a problem, but it's much more of a problem today when you see publications list sires on the basis of the offspring's earnings, the progeny earnings. I mean, come on, whoever wins the race in Saudi, they could be by a sire that stands in Iowa for $35, and that sire is going to be leading the list at least for part of the year based on that one anomalous purse. So there are a lot of problems, thinking about quality through the lens of big money. And I'm not a fan of it.
You're telling me that Mineshaft isn't the best stallion in the world this year because Senor Buscador. I mean, I love Mineshaft.
Yeah,
but no, I agree. That's pretty specious. I want to jump in so we can move on to Forever Young and Fierceness, and then we'll take a quick break after that and start talking about some of the general sire points. Forever Young is a very, very interesting horse to me. As far as I know, he's only run once since the Derby, I believe, and he won that race in Japan. He's a wild card. Like you could argue that he could have won or should have won the Derby, depending on whether or not you think Tyler Gaffalione should have been DQ'd, or whether the two horses hadn't bumped. I thought they cost each other the race, frankly. But he's obviously going to be a huge contender, a huge player. He's going to get overbet, I think, because of the Japanese. I'm still bitter about hitting the Derby try with a 20 to 1 shot on top, paying $550. Kind of bullshit was that.
You're still bitter about Pearl Harbor. I was going to say, wow, Joe, you really hold a grudge, man.
Okay, John. History student John Green over here. No, I'm bitter about my bets. Even when I win, I feel like I lose. But anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts on him and the best U.S. hope, which I think you correctly identified as Fierceness.
Yeah, I agree with you about Forever Young. He's a very interesting horse. He's my favorite horse in the race from a fan standpoint. And he's earned it with me. I didn't know what to think originally. When he ran his first race, he ran a couple of races in Japan, 2-3 races in Japan, and then they sent him to Saudi for the so-called Saudi Derby. And he won that race, but he won it in very workmanlike style over Bookham Dano, now a nice sprinter in the U.S., and that was a mile race. So looking back on that race superficially, Forever Young really had to work and grind to get up at the very last moment of that race to win over a horse that's probably better suited to sprint distances. But I learned subsequently by following what the interviews with the trainer of Forever Young that he had shipped poorly to Saudi. And I didn't learn that until he had won until after he had won the UAE Derby in Dubai 5 weeks later. And that was a more impressive effort. And so I really sat up in my chair when I read that quote, because shipping from, it's not as far as shipping from the US, but shipping from Japan to Saudi Arabia and not shipping well and still being able to gut out a victory like that, and then 5 weeks later move forward for a younger developing 3-year-old, was really impressive to me. It showed a toughness that I really admire. I think he probably would have won the Derby. I think it's one of the great outrages in recent decades that he wasn't at least placed second because of the interference in that race. And yeah, he's a big player here. He has had, to confirm your point, he has had one race fairly recently, which was off a long layoff, but he was obviously, in good shape for the race and won fairly comfortably. The people who know about Japanese racing seem to think that it was a pretty decent field. I don't have a strong opinion because I don't follow it closely. What I will say, it's just minutia, but in Japan, and it's not the only place in the world, Hong Kong too, in Japan, they weigh their horses before races.
Right.
And so he was roughly the same weight. He was just a few pounds heavier off of the layoff as presumably a more mature 3-year-old recently than when he had last raced in Japan before he even shipped to Saudi and Dubai. And I thought maybe that was a negative sign. But one of the guys who I follow who is from Japan and close to Japanese racing, gave me some examples, might have even included Equinox, of horses that over those periods of time don't necessarily put, some do, but they don't necessarily put on much weight. So I guess, you know, the way he ran in this prep race was good enough that I'm not going to worry about it at this point. But it struck me as being odd. I would have thought, because he's always looked like sort of like a little lighter body, but a little unfurnished. And I might have expected him to come back heavier and, you know, more muscled, but he didn't. I still like him. He's easy to root for, but he has the same limitation that City of Troy has, which is that he doesn't have a quick acceleration. He's a galloper. He's going to need a test of stamina to show his best. And I hope, my biggest hope for the Breeders' Cup Classic is that there's a good, minimally solid pace, preferably a strong pace, so that it's a true race, a truly run race. I don't want to see a log jam at the quarter pole because they went 47 and change and, you know, 111 and change or whatever. Yes, I like Forever Young. I think he's a big player. I hope he wins because, as three of us seem to be agreeing, it's a pretty weak field. And I think it's the kind of field that he'll be able to beat with, you know, a little bit of luck this time around. And he surely deserves it after the Breeders' Cup experience.
Yeah,
go ahead, Joe.
Just to piggyback on that, I think maybe a offshoot or an added benefit of him winning. Maybe we get some Japanese horses to come spice up some of these older horse handicap division races throughout the year. I know it's a long ship, but we've seen that in Europe. Charlie Appleby started to send more horses, not just for the Breeders' Cup, but for some of the bigger grade 1 stakes on turf. So I think that'd be an interesting component, and maybe some Japanese horses will take some other shots besides just the Classic or the Derby.
Yeah, my understanding, guys, is that, and again, we'll know better, you know, Wednesday afternoon. But my understanding is that there were 19 horses that were pre-entering into the races here in the States for the Breeders' Cup. Doesn't mean that all of them are going to run, but that was the indication, was that there's a dozen and a half or so horses that may be coming in from Japan. And I think it had to do greatly with the fact that, you know, last year with the success that Japanese horses had in the Breeders' Cup races, and then obviously with the success of you know, hitting the board you know, in the Kentucky Derby. So I think we're going to be seeing that more and more, especially with Breeders' Cup out in California this year.